Gartner, they do this hype cycle, which tells you where technology is. And they basically predicted, and this is back in 2007, they predicted that virtual worlds and the 3D web, the metaverse effectively, it'd be about 15 years time before it started to enter the mainstream, which is exactly right about now, actually.
All right, welcome to another episode of Built on Web3. Today we're thrilled to be chatting with Dele, who is the CEO and founder of MetaMe, as well as a few other things. So we'll get into everything you're up to in Web3. Dele, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we like to start off our interviews just by talking about Web3 in general, just to get a sense of how you view Web3 here in 2023. So Dele, what does Web3 mean to you?
I mean, good question. It's interesting. I wrote a book about Web3 back in 2012, and it's come to mean a lot of different things from what it means today. I think the general consensus view today, it's like a decentralized web, decentralized transactions, I think really epitomize what Web3 is about today.
Love it. And if you were to explain that to someone who might not really understand what that means, what decentralized means, or maybe you're explaining this to your mom or your dad or something, how would you explain Web3 to them?
Yeah, I mean, it's generally been the principle that's underpinned the internet from day one in many regards. But it's to explain it in very simple terms. It just basically means that you can enable things to happen, like transactions to occur, without having a central party. So like when you send a letter to someone in the old, if I was telling my grandmother in the old world where you used to send a letter by mail, then you'd have this centralized authority, a post office that would take those letters and then distribute them. But in a decentralized world, it's sort of almost like where there's a courier on every corner and you can just put it inside the courier and the courier makes sure it gets to where it's going. So you don't have this central authority that oversees it. And in the Web3 world, that is a network that facilitates that. And I suppose the thing that's really important in that regards is that you can do it in a way that is trustless. There's a term that's used in the space, i.e. that you're not afraid that when you give that letter to the courier that he's going to open it or send it to his cousin, but it's going to get to where you want it to go. And you don't have to worry that the person that's taking the letter or the facility that's taking the letter is going to interfere with that process in any way.
The only thing that could popped into my head was if you were comparing the postal service to the old world, I was already thinking about carrier pigeons and how they're the super old world and how that was way too centralized of a system for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Putting the trust into pigeons. Yeah. I want to go back to something you said. You said you wrote a book on Web3 in 2012. Sometimes Sean and I ask for predictions of hey, what's going to happen in 2023? But what were your predictions, or what were you thinking was going to happen in 2012, 10 years later? And what's actually, 10 years ago, what were your predictions and what are they now? Let's do a comparison.
That's a good point. Great question. And, I wrote the book because there was this whole sort of view that you can't predict what's happening in this space. And it's well, actually, you might not be able to predict what's happening in the next 2 or 3 years, but what's coming macro scale is kind of clear. There were 21 guiding principles around what was driving this transformation. So I think some that really stood out to me was me centricity. This idea that people would become a lot more self-centric and that they would become the kind of stars of their own stories was a trend that is on steroids now. At this stage, it was the whole sort of narrative around privacy was very nascent. And actually we were one of the first, we set up an NGO shortly after publishing this book to call for universal digital rights as an extension of human rights. And we were the first organization to call for that. And the idea of digital rights as human rights has now got a lot of momentum. I mean, even the UN has body to look at that. When we first approached the UN about it, it was like tumbleweed. So I think that's gotten a lot of traction. That social platforms would become bigger than states than many states in many regards, I think is another thing that we've seen come true. There, one of the things that I was excited about exploring in the book at the time was how we started to create virtual states, virtual nations. And, a great example was the island of Tivolo, which would be underwater by the end of this century, and the end of this decade, I believe. And so how do you deal with that, where there's a sovereign nation which has sovereign citizens that no longer has land? And, in the current global paradigm, there is no such thing as a nation state without land. Nation states are defined by land mass in that regard. So how would that happen? So, I explored this idea of virtual nations and virtual states emerging. And there's a lot of that happened at the early Web3 phase, and at the early, let's call it the crypto Web3 phase, which became, it's sort of died down a little bit, but kind of part of the lexicon and culture of the decentralized web, that you will actually get reorganizations. So DAOs weren't a thing back then, but I think what we're now starting to see is DAOs, the kind of the macro principle of DAOs, of these organizations that can be representative of sovereign entities, could emerge. And I think the other thing, generally, the decentralization, and I don't know that yeah, I mean, so there were a couple of ideas that were going around then, like multipolarity, and this idea that the 20th century world was kind of anchored around a few sort of superpowers. It was really the Eastern, Western superpowers, the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, if you will, the US-centric Western bloc. And that the idea that was emerging was that the world would become much more multipolar. You'd have several hubs, big hub blocks, and Brigham was emerging as one sort of block in that sense. And I think that that's the seeds of decentralization, that you would start to have these big epicenters, these big hubs around which distribution would occur, which would facilitate greater decentralization overall. So those are the kind of big ones that I think that sprung to mind that were, have played out in some sort of shape or form.
For sure. Yeah. So take us back to 2012. How did you end up getting involved in what we called crypto back then? So much so that you wrote a book about it. Yeah,
I mean, so it was really more about the web back then. And quite frankly, I think even, this Web3 nomenclature that we use now has really probably in the last 2, maybe 3 years being used to describe the crypto blockchain space. It was kind of moving, blockchain, crypto were moving on their own trajectory up until about 2020 or so, when this Web3 term started to become embraced by the crypto and blockchain community. But so, I had been doing a lot of work in multinationals. I've been heading up digital I was heading up digital. In fact, it started when I was at Diageo. I was heading up digital for Diageo, the big beverage company. And so I've been responsible for a lot of digital innovation. Interestingly enough, I was brought into Diageo to help them crack Web 2. So they had been quite mature in Web 1, and they needed someone to help them figure out Web 2. And I came in there, believe it or not. But my big pitch when I was being interviewed was Second Life. This is the future of the web. This is what Web3 is looking like, the metaverse kind of thing, before it was really called the metaverse. I mean, I hadn't read Snow Crash at that point anyway. So, and interestingly enough, I mean, a couple of synchronicities. When Facebook did its IPO, the only reference use case it used in its roadshow was Diageo. And I think and our most successful brand in digital social marketing was Smirnoff, and my business partner, the brand manager for Smirnoff, went on to become, I think she's actually now global CMO for Facebook. So, in many senses, I think it was an accomplished mission in that regards. But that got me thinking about, well, okay, what comes next after Web 2? What does Web 3 start to look like?
Yeah, so I'm interested in how, since you kind of lived through both, when you went to go lead digital at this company and you're pitching Second Life, like I imagine back then it was like the metaverse, like this really cool digital world that we could build, which is exactly what we're seeing now. So I'm curious how is it different than what you saw back then?
It's really shocking, actually. So we actually built a conference center. So my team that I led was basically distributed across four regions, Asia Pac, Europe, Latin America, and Middle East and Africa. And so we had meetings like every month on WebEx, they were just atrocious. It was a nightmare, right? So one of the first things, so what we actually did was create a virtual meeting space in Second Life. And it was crazy, none of our agencies understood what we were talking about. We had to find a really small boutique agency that could do the creative. And then IBM was our partner to do the infrastructure, get past the firewall and all of that stuff. So we built this thing and this meeting space with PowerPoint integration and whatnot. So two things I think were really interesting. I listened to Facebook's sort of vision of Horizon or whatever they call it, and the work, and it's no different to what we built back then, to be honest with you. In fact, in many ways, Google had a product called Lively, which was a browser-based virtual world kind of scenario. It was very light from a client application side perspective. And that was pretty much as advanced as what Facebook is basically touting these days. But the thing that was really interesting for me was that at the time, Gartner, they do this hype cycle, which tells you where technology is. And they basically predicted, and this is back in 2007 that we built this for Diageo, they predicted that virtual worlds and, the 3D web, the metaverse effectively, it'd be about 15 years time before it started to enter the mainstream, which is exactly right about now, actually. So
I wonder where the Gartner hype cycle chart is on the Gartner hype cycle chart.
Yeah,
because
right.
I see it everywhere now.
Right. Yeah, it's good.
When you said you went into Diageo to help bring Web 2 to this like Web 1 company, let's assume that now we are Web 2 companies and we're trying to get them to get into Web 3. What was the driver? What was like the primary driver or the foundational driver that you think can transcend what companies use to adopt Web 2 when they were Web 1 that we can use to help them adopt Web 3? Do you think that they're similar or what is that? Because there's not a lot of companies that are open to Web 3. Some are, but they're still experimenting.
Yeah, and I remember, back then even, people were up in arms about Facebook and going, taking brands into Facebook. But ultimately,
And that was just 10 years ago
yeah,
too.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, but ultimately, brands go where consumers go, and that's ultimately the driver. And I think with Diageo, particularly at the time, the issue that they were having was that their agencies were really struggling. They had a very centralized platform. It's all of these things they kind of swing it roundabouts, but they had a highly centralized and controlled platform that was run by an IT provider, and their agencies were really struggling to deliver campaigns that were connecting with consumers because people were on Facebook. Social media was really becoming a dominant form of marketing, of digital marketing in that regards. And TV was starting to wane in terms of its efficacy. So I think that was the sort of underpinning driver. I think when I look at that compared to where we are with Web3, what can be learned from that? I think, the challenge I think Web3 has at the moment is adoption. It's still too transactionally focused. Now, decentralized transactions make a huge difference and change everything. But I think the Web 2 versus, Web 3 was that, I mean, you could look at Web 2 and say that it was all about peer to peer. It was about giving the user a voice. It was about, two-way communications versus top-down, one-way broadcast communications. And that's true. Those technical things are true. But what it really translated to was that there was a cultural transformation that was happening, new digital culture that was emerging. And I think that that's the challenge that Web3 has at the moment, that it's still a bit too technical and financially isolated. NFTs and have broke the mold a bit to become a bit more of a cultural phenomena. But that's really where I think the transformation will really take hold when Web3 comes more than just a way of paying, because, online payments, through PayPal and e-commerce and stuff like that, isn't what really drove the big adoption of Web2. It was the cultural stuff that did.
So at what point did you kind of drop everything you were doing in Web 2 and start a Web 3 company?
So, I mean, it was a bit of a transition. So I first of all became interested in crypto blockchain in 2010 with the release of Bitcoin. And quite frankly, again, I wasn't really so fascinated or interested in it from the monetary perspective, but I loved the story. I loved the story that this guy, Satoshi Nakamoto, appeared and has created this new currency that's disrupting the world. And he's disappeared and he's anonymous. It was just like stranger than fiction. And I was just like, oh my God, this is
Straight out of a
incredible.
movie.
Yeah, I know. It was like incredible. So that's kind of what got me hooked. But I kept looking at it, and I was focused. At this time, I'd started to become quite focused on data as a resource, and the transformative power of data, but also all the issues around data privacy, digital rights, human rights, and all of this sort of stuff. And at that time, it didn't really have it was an interesting technology and phenomena, but there wasn't really any applicability to the data revolution, or the digital revolution in that regards that I saw. And then Ethereum came along in 2015 with smart contracts, and that changed everything, because now suddenly you had the ability to have, decentralized compute and, immutable logic, programmable logic that you could enforce. So that started to really in terms of its capability to address these more cultural, social issues around tech and data. So I started to look at it a lot more seriously then. And at that time, I think actually, 2015, I started working with IBM. In IBM, I was leading a lot of digital innovation, was sort of my role, innovation within automotive, aerospace, and defense. And so I was particularly interested in VR, mixed reality, and blockchain and crypto. So I started to do a lot of work on the enterprise side with clients around crypto and blockchain. And then in 2018, I jumped full feet headfirst into the space and set up MetaMe and started to really build out a protocol around what we're trying to achieve.
But before we get into MetaMe, I want to go back to what you said before about how you predicted that we would become more me-centric, like individualized, and how I don't know what the question is here, but there's something along there's this thought of Facebook's adoption and social media growth kind of helped, I think, exacerbate the whole like me-centric movement. But like, what was the driver of like just the consumer adoption of social media that helped it become such a dominant factor? And do you think that there's going to be the same thing for Web3? Because Web3 is even more me-centric in a way with like ownership.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that is the vector. You are absolutely 100% right. I think so there's an interesting thing that's happened with social media in Web 2, where the concept of me as as an entity that I can control has emerged. And of course, there's a lot of, we all know the dark side of social media and how destructive it can be on a social context. And I'm a big, champion for digital rights and for better mental health, protections from social media platforms in that regards, more responsibility and accountability from them. But I do think that we do also lose sight of some of the benefits. And, one of the things that for me is very distinct about Web 2 and social media compared to the world before was that in the, sort of pre-social web world, as an individual, you had very little control of your reputation or your profile or your persona that was presented to the world. I mean, you could only really manage it in a micro sense in the terms of, the people in your community that you interact with on a physical basis. And you had to be a celebrity, a captain of industry, or a government official, or an aristocrat to basically have the resources to be able to define your persona in a way that you wanted it defined. And social media has really changed that. And of course, everybody talks about how people put up fake personas and all whatnot. And that's kind of part of a process. But I think the ability to actually define yourself in that way is unprecedented. And that's a really powerful thing. And I think to your question, though, Thomas, I think that the challenge, of course, is that persona and that, all that constitutes that persona, you don't own currently. It's owned by these platforms who monetize it and utilize it and exploit it to exploit you effectively as a resource. As a resource to be mined and as a resource to be mined in terms of extraction of information and then mined in terms of extraction of your money, in terms of how you can be manipulated through that process. And the Web3 changes that dramatically because now suddenly, not only do you have the ability to shape your persona, your digital persona, which frankly is going to have much greater reach than your physical persona, right? Than your physical person. But you also have a chance now to own it. And that's, I think, a really massively fundamental shift in that social dynamic between citizens and the collective and as individuals and such.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So tell us about MetaMe and kind of what that means to own that part of ourselves digitally.
Yeah, I mean, so that's kind of the mission with MetaMe is effectively to create a framework for people to be able to take ownership of their digital selves, essentially. And we've gone through a little bit of a pivot with this, and it's partly because of where the technology has moved to recently. I've been very passionate about data and about people owning their data, and that has become more valuable than money. And it's there's a reason why all of these social platforms and all of these digital services like Search Google and the like are all provided for free. And to put it in simple terms, it's because they can never charge you as much for the service as they can make from your data, and in terms of having your data and providing the service to you for free. What are they going to charge you? $1,000 a year subscription? $5,000? They're making way more than that on your data. So you start to see that your data is actually worth more than money, than your money particularly as well, in that relative sense, right? So that's always sort of been a passion and direction, but it's so abstract for people. I think it's a difficult thing for people to grasp. So, but that, for us, when I think about digital rights and data sovereignty, you can bucket it really down into three core principles. One is privacy, which, is become pretty well discussed nowadays, and we're starting to understand the importance of that. The second, though, is property, and that is really about, well, your data as property, which has monetary value. And then the third, which is the really interesting one, is about agency. And that's really about freedom and, whether that's freedom or free will, free choice, because these things really, not only is democracy at risk from, the manipulation and exploitation that we are subject to through mass surveillance on these platforms, but the very notion of freedom, the very notion of free will, free choice is at risk because we're not really making free choices when everything is manipulated and in that regard. So that's kind of the important one. And where I see this now going, so what MetaMe really is focused on now is still a kind of data sovereignty, but the why of it is to use your data to create a personal AI. And that the idea is that the reality is that we are coming to a point now that as people, we are sort of like up against these industrial Goliath AI systems that are designed to manipulate us and in an extreme manner. And quite frankly, we are helpless against this kind of brute processing force that is applied to getting us to click on this or buy this or follow this person or lean our politics in a particular direction. So the only way that we'll start to actually be able to have a chance in this kind of world to have any kind of freedom is to have some sort of AI agent that's designed to serve our needs, that's designed and trained around our needs, our wants, and our desires, and our information. So that's essentially what MetaMe is aiming to build.
Yeah. So what will that look like? So once you guys build this out, and we all have our own personal AIs, can you kind of paint a picture of what that means for a user?
Yeah, I mean, but I mean, I will say that it's a journey, and the first journey to get there is to get to a collective kind of AI. And I think for me, that's really about combining machine intelligence with machine learning, if you will, and social intelligence. But I think what it gets to is, in the same way that you would ask Alexa or Siri, find me a restaurant or find me a flight or a trip, you would ask your AI agent to do the same, but it would be so much more effective because one, you've given it access to all of your information and you're not afraid to give it access to all of your information because it's designed to serve you. The more you've trained it on your information effectively. So the more data you collect, the better your AI is able to serve you. And so now I could say to my AI, in fact, rather than me even having to say to my AI that I've got an appointment with Thomas tomorrow in Boston, where we're both at for a conference, you guys you're meeting with you're meeting with Thomas tomorrow in Boston. Would you like me to book you a restaurant? And then it would then consult with Thomas's AI and find out what
Mm.
kind of cuisine Thomas likes, what his schedule is, what the time frame is, and both of our AIs would get together and organize a perfect meeting spot for us to have a session, have a lunch meeting whereby we can be super effective and give us all of our notes on what we previously discussed as we're going to that meeting.
Got it. So it's more of the personalization of our AIs know us so well that instead, like you ask ChatGPT right now, what's the best restaurant in Denver? It'll give us the average of the best
Exactly.
restaurant, and versus in this world, it would give me my best restaurant.
That's the money point, and that's the key to it. This is a really important insight. These industrial AI systems will never be able to compete with an individualized service because they have to gravitate towards the median. They have to gravitate towards the average. They're always going to give you this broad, bland result because that's the only way they can work. It's not operationally feasible for them to be able to customize themselves to your specific needs, and the amount of information that you would have to share with them for them to be able to do that would be dangerous for you to put in their hands based on their intent, and as well, you're not their customer. their customer is the enterprises who pay them to give them behavioral results. You are the not, it's not even the product, but it's your behavior. That's what they're really selling to enterprises, the ability to modify your behavior in the interest of enterprises. So there's a real conflict of interest. They're not designed to serve your needs in that regard. So they're never, and even if they try to, it would be super bland because they're they've got conflict of interest and informational disadvantage. It's like big data versus little data. Big data is good for population scale insights, but it's not good for individual based insights. Only little data can actually work towards that.
So, Dele, a lot of these concepts are cool, these business models, and like the future is very cool, but doesn't it echo the same types of lesson, or like the same thing that we have in the Web2 space of some sort of like almost re-centralization again? Because like, wouldn't MetaMe then be what incentives do you have as MetaMe? Like, because you also need to make money somehow, and aren't like, do you really control like I as a consumer, like would I really control like my AI, or is there some ulterior like training or something behind that?
So it's a complex question and it's multi-layered. So I think a couple of important points in that. So firstly, in our ecosystem, in the MetaMe system, yes, you own your data. Yes, you own your AI, and you have control and you train that around that. Um, a very important point around decentralization and centralization. And this is something that a lot of people in the Web3 space struggle with a bit. But it's not that everything actually needs to be decentralized. Because if you actually really think about self sovereignty, or if you look at the world right now, I mean, our data as individuals is kind of pretty decentralized right now. I mean, Facebook's got a chunk of it, Google's got a chunk of it, Amazon's got a chunk of it, Verizon's got a chunk of it, Social Security's got a chunk of it. Everybody's got it except us, right? So, in a
Yep.
way, it's pretty decentralized. When we talk about self sovereignty, that's back to this me centricity. What we're actually talking about is self centricity. So, what we actually are looking for is self centralization for our information, but decentralized interactions between ourselves as self-centralized entities, right? So and that's the thing. Sometimes you need centralization, sometimes you need decentralization. And that's the tricky thing that we need to work out. Which parts of the ecosystem need to be decentralized and which parts need to be centralized? And certainly from an individual perspective, we need to centralize our data around ourselves so that we can centralize our AIs around ourselves. And then from there, we can then start to talk about how do we act collectively,
Mm-hmm.
because we don't want to build self-centricity doesn't necessarily mean selfish. It can also be selfless, but it all starts with self. It's got to be centered around self and then we need to kind of teach people to get that balance between selfish and selflessness right. So so that's an important component. But I think to your question about does it differ from Web2, it differs because I think it does come down to both technical ownership. So Bitcoin, for example, gives you this really powerful way to own your cryptocurrency. It doesn't really matter what any legislators say or do. They can control the off ramps in terms of banks converting that into fiat, but it's pretty decentralized. You own that money, you own your Bitcoin, and there's nothing anyone can really do to change that. They can't take it away from you, especially if you have it in a cold wallet and self custody wallets. So you've basically given tech property rights through technology, and then you then overlay that with legislative rights and legal rights and all whatnot. So that's a really important point about what Web3 does. versus Web 2. The technology gives you a tangible manifestation of these property rights, of these protections, in a way that Web 2 does not and cannot do.
So
Um,
that could be a good segue
Sorry, go.
right there, because I still want to ask you about the business model, and I won't let you off the hook
Right,
with that.
sure.
I want to know
Yeah,
how MetaMe makes money,
absolutely.
because that's like a thing too. But
Sure.
this is going to be a good segue. Like, why are digital rights human rights?
Well, because basically it's an extension of the digital. The digital world is an extension of the analog world. And that's kind of, there's a lot of talk. It's a lot easier if you think about all of these realms, the digital realm, the metaverse, and all of these things as extensions of the real world. There's a lot of talk around how they're completely new spaces and all of that. And they have new attributes and new components, but they are extensions of this world. I find the term artificial intelligence a little bit misleading, because it's just intelligence, really. There's not really such a thing as artificial intelligence. It's just intelligence, and it's an extension of human intelligence, and all our innovations are an extension of our analog self in that regards. So, in that sense, our digital experience, as we see, you look at things like, I'm trying to put this across in a non-politically biased manner, but if you look at the changes that happen in the political landscape, like the January 6th storm of the Capitol links, for example, that happened through misinformation and through sort of exploitation across social channels, this stuff translates into the real world. And it is also about the mind. It's about the psyche. So it is important that we accord ourselves, that we recognize, because we do recognize in the physical world that we need to protect certain rights. We need to give people safety rails and put guardrails around the freedoms that we want to have. And so that naturally extends into the digital world, because the digital world is an extension of this physical world. And the same dangers that we face in the physical world exist in the digital world, although sometimes amplified and sometimes, distorted or different, but same in core, abuse, theft, and etc. All of these sort of normal things that we need to protect ourselves from in the physical world, we also need to protect ourselves in the digital world.
Mm-hmm. So, I guess, in your opinion, then, what would like good legislation look like around digital property rights? Like, what is like the perfect world that you envision that good legislation gets passed here?
So, I think a lot of these things are a lot more simple than they appear to be. Certainly right now, and there's a future that is a little bit more difficult to understand from a legislative perspective. I think I'll give you an example. Something that's more challenging is if you look at something like DNA records, right? Now, I have rights around my DNA information, but they're not exclusive rights to me, because my DNA is actually collective, and there's a whole clan or lineage or group of people who are impacted by decisions that I make with my DNA records. So if I go to 23andMe and decide to sequence my DNA, it's not just myself that I'm impacting. I'm impacting anyone who's part of that DNA line in that sense. So there are some complexities that you have to navigate around things like that. But I think, but to answer your question directly, first, I think all we really need to see happen at the moment is a transition that digital assets or digital things are property, and based on them being property, we can then bring them under the protections of property law. And this is something we're seeing in the NFT space, for example, whereby, and it's an interesting challenge, because I think the problem with the NFT space is that NFTs don't give you that technical protection around property at the moment. It's kind of, I mean, as we were saying in the prep for the call, we have a crypto media project, Meta Knights, that's really about, the battle for the soul of the metaverse, and it's all about digital collectibles. But so I'm very pro this space. I say that to say that I'm very pro this space. But they promise the language that people use around NFTs is I don't want to call it deceitful, but it's not exactly accurate, right? I mean, so the simple analogy I use with NFTs is that if you go and buy a song off iTunes in the old analog world, right? You pay 99 cents to get a song, you get an MP3 file, and you get an email as a receipt that you've got this song, right? Take that into the crypto world. Okay, you pay whatever in Matic or ETH for the song. You get an NFT instead of this email, which shows proof of receipt. But the MP3 file itself is completely outside of this whole thing, right? It's just you get a MP3 file delivered to you. So it doesn't address piracy. It doesn't address any of these issues that we see with digital media in that sense. You don't have the protections that are accorded by way of, like you have with a Bitcoin. If I send you a Bitcoin, you've got that Bitcoin, and no one can take it away from you unless you send it to someone else. That is not the case when we come to NFTs and digital assets in that sense. And that's partly because the industry's grown up on money and it doesn't know how to deal with data or content as a digital asset in that regard. So that's one of the things that we're addressing with MetaMe in terms of how we go about building this. But so that's the beginning. And that actually causes huge problems from a legal perspective now with NFTs. And there are all these cases like Hermes versus this artist, because when you come to copyright law, so again, back to property. So you have real property law, you have intellectual property law, and we can protect digital assets under those frameworks, real property and intellectual property. But the problem we have with intellectual property and copyright law now is that, well, the thing that is actually the property is the NFT, which is just like the receipt. It's not actually the object. So until you get to a point where the object itself is the thing that is protected by the technology, then you can bring it into the provisions of regular intellectual property law. It's a thing. It's a widget. It's a digital widget that is protected by copyright. Therefore, no one can replicate it without the proper provisions, rights, etc. No one can utilize it, without the proper rights provisions, etc. Accordingly. So I think the process is quite small. Just these little leaps to some technical leaps and some legal leaps.
Mm-hmm. So are we just missing case law then? Are we just is that the next step where we just need NFTs to kind of go through the courts and we need judges to make decisions that yes, this is viewed as property and we will protect it as a government?
In some regards, yes, but I think that there's technical flaws at the moment as well. So I think the NFTs, and we've been working on this, and there are other people working on solutions as well. But effectively, you need to first of all have a technical solution whereby the MP3 file in the music case, right, needs to be the crypto object. It needs to be a primitive. You need to have that as the crypto object, and then we can describe that, define that as property. So, so two things need to happen. We need to create the framework whereby the MP3 file is a crypto primitive, where you can execute ownership rights, property rights around it technically, like you can with a Bitcoin or with a cryptocurrency. So we're working on a solution around that. And then the second thing then is for law just to recognize that, well, okay, this is a digital property. This digital property is just like any other property, whether it's intellectual or real property, and can be protected by those.
If we wanted to dumb that down to a real world or as close to a old world example, I like the new world and old world kind of idea here. But so what you're talking about is that MP3 that you get, or this image that you get. Right now you get the JPEG, and then you also get this NFT. The NFT is that receipt. This is kind of, and what you're saying is we want to combine the two so that the
Yes.
two are one, and then that becomes that unique object, kind of akin to like if you watch a movie at a movie theater, they have a secret watermark so that if you record a movie, you kind of know like, hey, that this movie was actually intended just for this business, for this audience. Or like a
Yes.
secret signature within an MP3 that says, hey, this song was actually intended just for this user.
I think that was called DRM.
Yeah.
Part of it is digital rights management. I mean, but again, it's like, I mean, look at, I mean, there's a kind of, I feel a bit like a digital archaeologist sometimes, but you look at Bitcoin came out of BitTorrent, right? The peer-to-peer bit peer-to-peer
Yeah.
framework, which is kind of what the internet always has been. But Napster obviously is the great use case of that, and how it transformed the music industry because of piracy and this whole thing. That's the fundamental problem that we've had with digital media, this ability to replicate it. Once something is digitized, you can replicate it very easily, and therefore it's subject to large piracy. And NFTs do not solve that problem. They kind of solve it in a very, it's kind of like they solve it in a very superficial way. It's like if you have an
With the
ice cream,
receipt, does
right?
it say like, hey, yeah,
Yeah,
this
with a
receipt is
receipt.
fine?
It's
Yeah.
like you have an ice cream and I come and take the ice cream away from you and I eat it and you show me, but this is my receipt. This is my receipt. What use is that to you, right? You have to then, what are you going to do? Go to a centralized authority, a police officer or a judge or a court to try and enforce action against this receipt that you have? But meanwhile, the ice cream is eaten. So that's the it's a bit it's a there's a lot of talk about what NFTs could be, but until that problem is addressed, you're not actually solving the real problem that is around digital media.
So the problem here is the media that's attached to the receipt, because there are still a lot of valid cases for the receipt, the
Yes,
NFTs, right?
yes,
Like memberships being one. Like
yes,
you can token gate something and I get to say,
yeah,
hey, I own this thing. Here's my receipt.
yeah,
And they say, cool. The
yeah,
media doesn't matter in that case. This is kind of like a
yes,
thing that's
exactly.
there. So what you're
Yes,
saying is we need to somehow encapsulate the media as part of that receipt.
absolutely. Because I mean, token gating, interesting one, because the NFT then is the thing, right? The access that it's the key that gives you access to this
It's
community.
just,
It is the
it's the
thing.
original Mona Lisa.
Yes,
And you can tell like
yes,
that this is
it's
not,
real.
yeah, fabricated.
Exactly.
Yep.
And it can't be replicated. Someone else takes a copy of that, it's not going to give them access.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So maybe we can dive into a little bit more like intellectual property. I assume you're tackling that with the Meta Knights, I think you called it. Tell us
Yeah.
about that project and kind of how you're handling all this.
Yeah, I mean, Meta Knights is basically it's a fictional story about this battle for the soul of the metaverse, and it basically, we've done a lot of work on the policy and tech side, on the left brain side of the house, right, in terms of policy, regulation, protocols, technology, solutions, and all of that. But I realize, we're not going to get a mass movement and get people to connect with this stuff unless we find a way to connect with them emotionally around it. So we created Meta Knights as a fictional franchise to, we call it transforming ownership through storytelling and play. That's kind of our mission with Metaya Media, the company that we spun out to oversee this. And, the idea is that we inspire people, particularly Gen Zs, to understand or to be curious, to address the question of why about crypto, Web3, decentralization. To give them a reason as to why this stuff is important. And then through play, so we're creating a video game as well around it and a metaverse platform around it, through play to then teach how. So how do you have a wallet? How do you, what is a public key, private key? What's how you do transactions? What's cold storage? What's token gated access? What are all of these things? Teach that through play. Um, so that's sort of the thing, and it becomes its own IP. And so what we've done in that sense as well is the story takes the form of a comic saga, motion, and we've created various formats, comics and animations like motion comics around it, which we distribute as NFTs or we distribute in as these digital collectibles. So in that sense, it's our first pilot use case around this new type of crypto media, as we call it, which becomes this more, ownable media. So we're building out our protocol around that, and then Mennonites will be the first proof of concept of how an ecosystem and how a function like this can work.
So this seems like it's following a similar play that Sean and I have actually been seeing through different kind of initiatives that are like they don't advertise themselves as crypto or Web3 or NFT things, but they have that element behind the scenes. And I like that because it helps kind of break down that really terrible UI UX that anything with Web3 has to do with right now, because it's infuriating and it's really complex unless you know how to do it.
Absolutely, and I agree. And I think I sometimes get up in arms about Web3 because I'm not a big fan of the term, to be honest with you, um, because I feel in some ways the web is all about experience, and I think we're much closer to an Internet 2 world than a Web3 world. Particularly from a user experience perspective, we're kind of like it's like pre-Windows, right? It's like DOS, where we are in the Web3 space.
Windows 95, 98
Yeah,
is not even around the corner. Yeah,
do you know what I
maybe
mean?
it is.
But and all of that to consumers and mass markets is meaningless, right? In terms of if you think about it, even like with Web 2, it's sort of like, could you determine what was a Web 2 interface versus a Web 1 interface? Okay, Web 1, Web 2 kind of had, if you were going to take a very strict definition, you would say it had user inputs like comments and feedback and two-way sort of comms and whatnot. But overall, you just kind of started to move towards this journey of best practice. I mean, for me, I think two Web 2 apps that are phenomenal in terms of user experience, Tinder and Uber. Literally just click a button and something knows where you are. All of that stuff that it does in the background, knows where you are, comes and gets a driver to you, tell it where you're going, and that's it. No payment, nothing, all done. Amazing. And similarly, with Tinder, swipe left, swipe right. It doesn't get easier than that. So as Web 3 has to go beyond that, it has to be an even better user experience, an even simpler user interface than that. And so I feel like the interface experiences that we have today are very much Internet 2 more than Web 3 in that regards. But yes.
I wonder if the current kind of best UX practice is having a nice UI right now in like our Web 2 world. I it'll be kind of cool to see that shift towards like, yes, we'll still have a nice UI in Web3, but the UX component will be that personalization aspect versus just UI.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think you're right. That's where the magic starts, like Uber in that sense, GPS and all of these significant technological innovations that had to happen for that simple service of you clicking a button and knowing where you are and you telling where it's going, where you're going, and it tells you how long and all of this sort of stuff. The Web 3 stuff is the rich functionality and the new type of functionality. The interface needs to be very simple, intuitive, and I think AI is going to play an important role in that as well. Voice and chat are going to become increasingly important parts of the user interface, and the Web 3 will give us better security, better personalization, because we'll be able to share richer data because because it's trustless. We won't be worried about what happens to that data in that regards. And yeah, I think then you start to have a real sort of next generation internet experience being possible.
As we're talking here, it seems like you have like 3 or 4 companies that you are running right now in Web3, all of which are very long-term, like no obvious way to make money right now. How are you funding all of this and how are you making money?
Yeah, making money. That's yeah. Let's get back to the business model. I was just mindful of that as well. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think, but I mean, so Meta Knights, we ran a Reg CF campaign. We raised $1 million against that, and we're getting ready to launch a second one where we can raise up to 5 million. We're community funded in that regards, and our projects have not necessarily, we've always been a bit ahead of the market. So that's always been challenging with venture capitalists and the like. But I think the market tends to understand. We can talk to the market quite well. And we've been quite successful in that sense. And with MetaMe,
can you redefine? Can you repeat that again? Of like, how did you raise $1 million? What was that through?
Through crowdfunding. So we ran a campaign on startengine.com. And but that's something again that changed with the Jobs Act recently in the last 3 or 4 years. So we can basically raise funding directly from consumers. And it's a great model because you not only raise capital, but you build a community and you build a customer base at the same time. So that's been interesting. And now we're in the sales cycle with Meta Knights, where we're selling our comics and collectibles associated with the saga as well. And there's licensing. So that's kind of Meta Knights is a content company more than, and it's like a next generation content, next generation media. But so licensing is a big sort of pathway to revenue. We're working on several licensing deals around that at the moment. But to answer your question very specifically on the MetaMe side, on the data monetization side, I mean, our model is relatively straightforward. It's like a triple-sided market, but for simplicity's sake, just say a double-sided market, whereby we enable people to monetize their data with brands in a zero-party manner, and we take a cut of a commission from both brands and consumers. So our interests are very, very deliberately aligned with both sides of the market in that regards. We serve both customers in that regards, and we help consumers get the maximum value for their data, and also enterprises as well get the maximum value for their data because they behave like entities in that regards who can collect their data and kind of monetize it in that regards. So that's one business model side of it, which is quite straightforward, and we think that really scales. The question always becomes the value of the data, but that's just a quota kind of thing. And then licensing the platform to third parties, but in many ways, a lot of the core IP NGO, so we want to make it most of the core IP open source. So, but MetaMe is sort of like the red hat in our ecosystem that then kind of builds application level interfaces and things like that that can be monetized through licensing or through value added services that it creates on top of the protocol effectively.
Got it. Well, that hour went by way faster than I thought. I didn't look at the clock until just now. So, Dele, thanks for being on the show. This was a lot of fun. We learned a ton.
Thank you. It's been great fun. Thank you for having me.